the very capacity to like tune in deeply, be really present to what's going on, not knowing where it's going to go. Like that is probably one of the best kits that you can download and bring to a conversation with your spouse. Because if you can stay with that, you know, the very, very finely tuned correspondences that often exist between us and our partners, us and our soulmates. Like there's kind of ancestral lines there as well. And when we can tune into that, like the soulmate partnership becomes this place where, you know, healing and awakening is happening between men and women as well. Um, and that was a really deep response to Mahan's question, but I also realized we kind of didn't answer directly at the cultural level. So I wanted to do that as well. Um, yeah, we feel that as well. And we've walked with that. And I I think having participated in this work for so long, I've reached a place where I don't actually have fear to kind of stand in that like necessity and value of what we're engaging in as men. And I think that's a very critical first piece is just like not being kind of kowtowed into fear. And there are still a lot of, you know, adult men who would be afraid to be associated with something like this because they are sensing into a cultural climate of attack and reaction that is directed around these themes and, you know, even penetrates into workplaces and companies and all of this stuff. Like this is a real cultural force we're contending with, but it's a cultural force that ultimately has a kind of trauma at its heart, and that has to be met in kind. It has to be met at a deeper level. We're not looking for a kind of politically reactive, immature um, backlash of like we're gonna be the boys and go and do our own thing and fuck all of you lot.
No girls
It's
allowed.
no girls
Boys Club.
allowed. I'm just Ken. No, it's deeply in service of women. It's in service of healing the collective cultural wounds, which we see as really deeply associated with what people are pointing at when they're saying patriarchy, like that sense of power through separation, power through domination, um, like a deep sense of, yeah, like what it means to be a man being based upon a kind of domination of the external world and a rejection of interiority and a kind of leaving and putting all of that onto women. Like, I'm not going to ever feel my own feelings except when I find myself with a woman, and then she's going to be kind of responsible for dealing with that. And I'm not going to co-regulate that. I'm not going to develop that with other men because we don't do that. That's dangerous or homoerotic or threatening or any of those things. Um, yeah, this to me represents the evolution that gets us out of this paralyzing, exhausting cultural situation of being at each other and not being able to actually celebrate and ennoble one another as men, as women, as divine bodies that bring together, you know, the greater masculine, the divine masculine, and the divine feminine. And we need to have both. And we believe that there's a warrior spirit that's available to us as men that isn't rooted in that kind of separation that you could consider kind of drove the First World War and drove that kind of insane conflict where you have European Christian men with very similar cultures just massacring each other on scale in the name of nation states. There's a way in which we can be connected with our warrior, and our warrior is deeply connected to spirit. It's deeply connected to the earth. It's deeply connected to who we're serving, what we're standing for. Um, and I believe that we're in a climate that actually demands that, like the possibility of new forms of tyranny, the possibility of new civilizational breakdown is upon
No
us.
shortage of problems, all right. Plenty of wars
No
to fight.
shortage of problems and an enormous shortage of real male embodied leadership that's rooted in the feminine. And that's the new wave. That's what gets us into a new place. And this is a first step in that direction.
Wow. You put it so much better than I could, Jacob. I could never capture that in that way, but it's absolutely what I agree with. And I was thinking as you were speaking, like even for me, like to post it on LinkedIn that I'm doing a men's group has a kind of edgy feeling to it. Because as you say, we're in this culture where we're so contested and it could be misunderstood. Or I wonder, like, what are all the people who aren't liking this thinking? Like, the idea that the men are now oppressed and need to kind of band together to survive. That's obviously not what this is about. And I loved how you expressed what it is about. But I just wanted to own that there is that free song of like, am I allowed to have a men's group? Is it kind of acceptable
Yeah,
and
but it's
polite
such
in
a crazy
society?
idea of like
Yeah.
men working on themselves should be rejected.
Yeah.
Like, do you want men that are incapable of like relating to other people? Like, I've always found that side of things very pathological, to be honest, in a sense of almost just like there's a very large like cultural critique going on there that doesn't really have men's well-being or development at it as a goal. Like, it doesn't really care about that, in fact. And a lot of the advice and the ideas don't really lead to men having better lives. And, men that have better lives that are advancing themselves will be better sons, they'll be better fathers, they'll be better boyfriends, they'll be better leaders. It's insane to think that a society could function without men that are advancing themselves and improving. Like, and so, they have to find some way of doing it. And men's groups obviously seems to be a way of scratching that itch.
And to be fair, I haven't actually directly encountered any criticism or hostility over it. Like it's more in my mind that I'm venturing across a sort of unspoken edge by sharing this. And actually, it's often the women who are the first to comment and
Mhm.
celebrate the idea of this work. So I do feel there's a lot of receptivity, but nonetheless, like there's still a little I have to overcome a little hump of resistance to put it out there from that like Jacob said, that field, we're in this field where there's a lot of contestation over this, and we don't want to get drawn into the crossfire inadvertently.
You don't want to become part of the manosphere,
No, no,
the
exactly. And
red
also
pill
that's it. I,
community.
I, I think that's, yeah, you've made the point that, there are these really unhealthy, really, really shadow masculine figures and trends that are identifiable, and that it would be, the danger, I guess, is feeling oneself to be almost conflated by that, by default almost. But I don't think that's what's happening. But I guess there is, maybe that's part of what has
That's the
been my
fear.
hesitation at moments. It's like, are they going to think that I'm kind of Andrew Tate, which obviously isn't the case.
Yeah.
But yeah, because that's out there, it just feels like it's a kind of, you have to be very clear about what it is and isn't. But I admire you, Jacob, because you just have no truck for that. Like, like you embolden me to not kind of get caught up in worrying about whether I might get misinterpreted, and I appreciate that courage.
Well, to speak to my own journey, I can say that there's been many, many, many junctures where I took a step that I thought was going to bring down hell and fury or completely transform how people perceived me, and consistently, um, almost nothing happens. So, uh, yeah, until you become someone of real power and influence, then then the swarms come for you, and then you really better have cultivated that courage step by step
Yeah,
along the way to
yeah.
actually take your stand, because it was, when you have voice that has impact, there are people who come to undermine that. um yeah.
Definitely. But there is that, I think there's the good side of that manosphere kind of early thing that like Jordan Peterson was so intrinsic in me, really like changing my life and like so important. And then you hear him lumped in with Andrew Tate, and you're like, well, they're not the same. Like, you know, there's qualitative levels to this, and side of that manosphere is very materialistic, teaching men to be like avoidant personality types that just lie to women to manipulate them. It's not really a good long-term strategy. Like, so I think you can separate like the good ones from the bad ones based like, you know, pretty easily. And yeah, so I think it's just, yeah, propaganda, isn't it, that you get lumped in together with something like that. It doesn't necessarily reflect on people that are doing good work for men.
Mm. Yeah, it reminds me what was coming up when you were speaking, Malhan, about this kind of like there's this reactive force that isn't interested in men's becoming. And when I feel into like where is that really coming from, I think it's the trauma of a cultural history where that was what was done to women. And it's a context in which there were men who didn't want their women to be empowered. They wanted their women to be dependent upon them. And so, you know, just a few generations later, we go through this kind of like reversal, and this often happens in collective trauma patterns. Like you go from being an oppressed victim to trying to enact what you experienced upon your perceived oppressor. And there's this awful reversal and polarization that occurs. And once you begin
Mhm.
to understand those dynamics and the kind of science of trauma that me and Matthew are engaged in, you start to see how that governs a lot of the culture war landscape. And so giving people a kind of fluency in that and being able to kind of read that layer helps a lot. And ultimately, yeah, I think women who are connected with themselves, connected with their bodies, connected with their purpose, connected with their spirituality, want men who are connected with themselves, their bodies, and their purpose and their spirituality and stand on their own 2 feet. And that's ultimately the most attractive and desirable thing for a partner and for a father and for a leader in culture. And truth shines with its own resonance.
Yeah,
And those
I
were the
agree.
ears to
I
hear.
just think there's also an element of painting a picture of the past as this oppressor oppressed narrative of like men oppressed women in the past. Like if you talk to your grandmother probably doesn't think she's oppressed. Like your grandmother's probably like, we had a nice time. It was actually like pretty fine. Like their lives are very different. Like in Ireland in the 1950s, like it was like a third world country. Like it's a totally different place. Like if we project the things we do now back to there, it's going to look ridiculous. But like they were people doing the best with what they had. Some of them were cunts, some of them were not nice to each other and were abusive. But I don't think everybody was abusing each other. You know what I mean? Like there were people loved each
Mm.
other. Like love isn't
Mm.
a modern invention. You know what I mean? Like it's not, if anything, we struggle to love each other more now, I would say, because we're more selfish. So I think there's plenty of examples of men and women in the past who have unbelievable relationships. My grandfather is currently in hospital, and my granny's going in to see him every day, and you know, trying to take care of him, even though she can barely take care of herself. And it's like heartbreaking to see. But they've done everything for each other, and they were born, you know, in the 1920s. Like, so I think there's an element of there's a bit of an illusion there going on that men and women are adversarial in some way, when really we're complementary to each other. Like we're really made for each other. Like we're not meant to have this, you know, intergender civil war that's been going on for the last while. So yeah, that was just something that was coming up.
I think that's really beautiful. And it's really important to include that. And I was just thinking the other day, like, where my mind sometimes goes archetypally, like how many true loves have there been throughout all of history? Like if you think of man and woman as expressions of the divine, you know, how many times have has true love found its other? How many times has it found its face throughout time immemorial? And as you say, you know, men and women have come together to face enormous hardship throughout history and serving one another. And that's what the institution of marriage, you know, in its highest form was about. It was about devotion and service to one another. It wasn't about um, ownership and domination of one another. Um, and it's important that we rescue the good and true from the past and not you know, project backwards a kind of revolutionary, painful further in simplification and being equipped with philosophy and the capacity to dialogue and distinguish and make sense together is part of the toolkit that men are being deprived of today, and women as well. And we need to develop that in that capacity. And I think that actually eventually creates the context where when these illusions come to rise in conversation, we can address them. Um, yeah, and also just sending love to your grandfather and your grandmother, and it's very yeah, it's very heartening to hear about that kind of later life bond and devotion as well.
Yeah, it's inspirational, man. It's unbelievable to see, really. They could be married for, my granddad's 89 now. So they've been married for like 58 years or something like that, or when they were like 20. And I think that's something, because like for me as man, I want to be a father, I want to be a husband, you know, choosing that relationship. Your relationship to women is very important, and to a woman, you know, you might be able to get lots of women, but keeping one of them is a different story. You do need to be able to go deeper on that. So I think for men, uh, our culture oscillates between that, like Andrew Tate, get a million women, or like, you know, just stay at home in your room and play video games. There is another way uh, that might be better for you.
Any closing thoughts here, Matthew?
I've really felt very I felt like this dialogue has clarified for me why I'm doing this. It's brought some new language to that, which is really powerful. And at the same time, it's really reminded me of the tenderness of it as well, and the the beauty of the work in the moment as we do it, but also the what follows from and grows from it. And also very touched, Mahon, by your example of your grandparents, and really wanting to send them both whatever energies we can send from our dialogue to support them, and really honor their example. I mean, there's a real beautiful way for us to close, I think, to really honor them and all they've been through and all that commitment. It's something
It's
very,
inspirational, man.
very
Thank you.
powerful about that. Yeah.